it's very funny that we have pop music telling us how to be true to ourselves and be your true self and love yourself, and then we act in such horrible ways and we don't do it.
Welcome to the Crooked Table podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yanis Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table podcast. This is Rob. On this show, we democratize the film criticism conversation by bringing on fans and critics alike to dig into their personal connection to a current or classic release. This week, I am honored to be joined by Bianca Garner. Welcome to the Crooked Table podcast.
Hi, welcome. I'm welcoming you. I'm so used to doing my own podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So that's actually a good segue. So tell listeners that I somehow are involved in film Twitter and don't know who you are. Can you tell people a little bit about Filmotomy and also your new podcast you're going to be starting?
Yeah, so I'm B, also known as the Film Bee over at Twitter, and I do a lot of different things, but my main focus is writing and hosting the Filmotomy podcast. I do basically we cover all sorts of films. We're just winding up Rewind from 1979, so we went back to 1979 and covered loads of films from that year, and then we also have our own filmmakers festival coming up in September, which will be focusing all on female filmmakers, past and present. And I have some big news, which is kind of exciting. I'm also going to be launching my own podcast soon, which is called In Their Own League, which is a podcast which centers all around female filmmakers, not just filmmakers, but screenwriters, producers, cinematographers, editors, everybody, working in the industry and examining their work. So yeah, I do quite a lot. I also write for Next Best Picture, Jump Cut Online, and VODzilla as well. So yeah. Oh, I'm out of breath.
I know. I was going to say, other than how do you find time for all of that? How is that process going of starting your own podcast? After, I'm sure having all the experience with Filmotomy really helps and all of that. So how is that? How have you found that process of kind of brainstorming the concept and all of that?
Well, coming up with the actual concept of the podcast is the easy part, I think, because it's I just thought, well, I've always really wanted to champion female filmmakers and those working in the industry who are underrepresented. So that's what I want my podcast to be. And probably the hardest part is trying to find a microphone. It's all the technical bits. I've just been talking to a lot of people trying to be like, which one do you recommend? Which editing software do you use?
Right.
Yeah, that's the side of things, which is the bit that's taken the most time. Actually getting the idea of the podcast came to me just that sort of light bulb moment. And yeah.
I love that in the podcasting community, or I guess specifically in the film podcasting community, I feel like I'm seeing more and more people create their own shows from their own point of view, having more representation of LGBT, of female, of women, people of color, and things like that. And I think, speaking as a primarily white guy who has a podcast, there's a lot of white guys on podcasts, so it's nice to have diversity of voices and bring, because a lot of times you bring something to the forefront that hasn't really been considered or really discussed very much and things like that. And I think that's an exciting venture that you have going on. And I look forward to checking it out and listening to it.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. And I would be honored to have you join us as a guest.
Oh, absolutely.
In the future, because I think we've got loads in common. And what I want to do with the podcast is bring everybody on board and get their perspective and point of view, because I think yours is probably going to be different to mine, and that's what I find interesting.
Well, that's part of with this show. That's part of why I like bringing on different people every week. So it's me and this week it's me and you, and next week it'll be me and somebody completely different, and just brings in the different voices constantly. So I'm getting different perspectives, or they're bringing different movies that either I hadn't seen, or like this one that I saw years ago, and it was like, time to reconsider that. And of course, the movie you brought is from a female filmmaker, female screenwriters, and we'll get into why that is so pertinent shortly. But yeah, I think that's really important. And because you're really plugged into film Twitter, as I am, and I feel like every week there's a new controversy. Like as of this recording, it's the what is it, the Hollywood Reporter with that Dora the Explorer thing, and I'm like, oh, dude, really? It's like, come on. It's just cries for help as far as diversity and representation, things like that. So it's cool to be seeing more and more of that.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess before we get any further, you wanted to pick this movie for a specific reason. You said American Psycho, which is what we're going to talk about here, is one of your favorite films. So we'll get into that in a minute. So let's just first listen to a little bit of the trailer right now.
I feel lethal, on the verge of frenzy. I think my mask of sanity is about to slip. Do you have any witnesses or fingerprints?
Actually, yes.
You're
inhuman.
I know my behavior can be erratic sometimes.
Hey, Paul!
So, what do you do?
I'm into, murders and executions mostly. I have all the characteristics of a human being, but not a single clear, identifiable emotion. I simply am not there.
I just had to kill a lot of people!
That was a little bit of the trailer for American Psycho, directed by Mary Harron. So what is it about this movie that made you select this one to talk about?
I think it's a movie that initially, when I first watched it, I was very horrified by, and it didn't really, I was kind of confused, and I felt a bit uncomfortable watching it. I kind of had this initial response of, I like this film, but I don't know if I should be liking it. And I think it's a film which is saying a lot, but I think it gets often misinterpreted, misunderstood and read the wrong way. And as a result, it's almost like Chinese whispers that people say, oh, it's about this, it's about that. And they take away a completely different meaning to what the film is actually saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a reputation to it. It's kind of like a film like Fight Club. It's almost been taken over and adopted as this, film all about masculinity. But I think it's a little bit more than that. It's a little bit more than toxic masculinity. It's saying something on a bigger scale about society as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really interesting that it comes from a female filmmaker, because I wasn't aware until many, many years later, after I actually done some research into the film. And a lot of it is really, when you realize that, you read the film in a completely different way. And it's a very feminist film for me. Even though the main character is a male, there are a lot of things it's saying about masculinity and identity, which I don't think a male director would have necessarily been able to convey. And they would have perhaps focused more on the violence and the sexual aspects of the film's narrative, where I think this is really an interesting, complex character study, but also a study of society as a whole, at least Western society as a whole, and capitalism and that sort of consumer culture that we find ourselves in. Makes sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, when did you first see it? When did you first see the movie?
I probably saw it when I was 18, I guess. So I didn't watch it when I was like super young or anything.
That's
but,
good.
Yeah. I know that there's been some people who have said, "Oh, I saw this at 10 years old," and you think, "Oh, okay, that explains a lot." But yeah, so I kind of caught it, and I think I watched it with my partner. So we were just sort of, he had heard about it, I had heard about it, so we went into it, and we both were like, I think he was expecting a bit more, violence and gore, kind of like, a slasher type of movie, but what we got was something completely different.
Well, it's also too with the poster and like the tagline is like killer looks. It's like it's marketed almost like a slasher film, kind of like in the way that the straight to video like quasi sequel that they did with Mila Kunis, where it was just like derivative and just kind of I guess kind of pointless. But because for me, I actually saw this. I think I saw part of it like flipping around on TV one day, and I saw the worst part to stumble across, which is the aftermath of the sex scene with that involves the chainsaw and all of that. Like that's the part that I saw. That was my first impression, was seeing that scene with what is it? I guess air quotes Christy, seeing the blood under the sheets and then him chasing her into the stairwell. This was my first impression of the movie. So I was like, what the hell is this? So it took me a while to actually come around to, all right, let me watch this. I think it was probably either right before or right around the time of Batman Begins, because I'd seen The Machinist, which actually has some thematic connections, I think, to this movie, another Christian Bale film. And yeah, so that was my initial impression. And I watched it then, and like I knew I could see what it was going for, but I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it, because the movie is disturbing in a lot of ways, but it's good. It's considered almost more of a dark comedy, I guess. It's kind of shrugging to that, because it's like I see the elements of that. But would you consider this more of a dark comedy or more of a satire or horror? Like, how would you even categorize this? Because it's one of those films that kind of defies categorization, I guess.
It's a satire in a way, but it is a horror, but it's not a horror in the sense of like a psychological horror or or a slasher movie. I think it's more a horror to do with the horror of society.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. If we let the sort of toxicity of society run rampant, that's what the result is. We get these Patrick Bateman style characters who think they can get away with murder. And, he does to a degree. I mean, I don't know how much of it is real, but he's not the only character in that film who is up to no good. All of them that he interacts with are pieces of work. So I don't want to say, I mean, there's definitely a lot of dark comedy in it. I mean, that business card scene is a classic example.
And it's, to your point about the violence, I think it's telling that in my research preparing for this episode, I kept coming across that the Bret Easton Ellis novel that came out, that this is based on, that came out 9 years. This movie came out in 2000. That book, I think, is from 1991. Was much, much more violent, much like more graphic in its depictions of things. Like he even in the film itself, when he's the big scene, which we'll get to later, where Christian Bale is on the phone and or Patrick Bateman is on the phone and he's confessing all the crimes. Like we didn't see half of that, and he's talking about, I ate some of their brains, like really grotesque imagery that the movie just doesn't even touch. It just kind of skates by with as little on-screen violence as possible. With the scene with Paul Allen, you see the blood go on Patrick's face. You don't see the aftermath. Like there's a lot more implied violence than there is actual on-screen violence in this film. And I think that's a part of it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's why it's more effective, because our imagination is then used to fill in the blanks, because we're like, okay, what's happened to his body? Where did it go? Like, and then we see all these, that's the bit where Chrissy runs into the cupboard, and there's those poor women hanging up like suits on hangers. Like, how did that happen? And I think that's what's disturbing about the film, is that so much is left for us to come up with, and that's forcing us as a viewer to think like Patrick Bateman. Yeah, it makes it for a very uncomfortable watch.
So you mentioned identity earlier, and I think that's really telling. That's a really interesting angle that this film delves into, because his whole thing is he's this, fit white guy, late 20s, early 30s, whatever, and he's basically works with a bunch of people who wear the exact same glasses as him, have business cards that look pretty much the same. I mean, they're all vice presidents. They like basically just carbon copy corporate drones, basically. And I think, it makes sense to set it in the 80s, because that's all the height of excess, the height of, everybody's doing cocaine and listening to like new wave music or whatever. And the movie does a great job of establishing that time and really tapping into like the whole Wall Street greed is good vibe of that era. And he's mentioned several times, Patrick, that he can't quit. Evelyn says, you should quit your job, and he's like, I can't, I want to fit in. And his whole thing is the pressure that he feels to be good enough or to prove himself. And then, the violent urges, I guess, simmering under the surface are just his, like, that he can't deal. That's like the way that the stress weighs on him. So speak to that a little about that side of the film.
Yeah, I think it's this case of this need to conform, even though you want to be an individual, you want to stand out, but is it sometimes this overwhelming sense of having to be like everybody else, because you don't want to become a social miscast, because right. If he was to admit to the worst, I think the worst insult for him to receive is, at the end where his lawyer calls him a dork or something, this idea of being seen as not a macho man and not this strong popular guy, that sends him on a spiral course. And maybe that's a reason that he acts out in these really like masculine ways of committing such horrible crimes, is because how else is he meant to represent himself, how then and stand out from the crowd with his to be individual, then there isn't any other way, because he's stuck in this culture where everybody wants to be like everyone else. And I think it's coming from a 2019 perspective with social media and Instagram and YouTube, and everybody seems to want to be like everyone else now. We all want the same sort of thing. We all want to have a million followers on Snapchat, or
everybody's looking for external validation, basically.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting film, because if you take away that idea of being an individual and you strip it away, then what are you left with? And how do you respond to that as mentally? And I think that we see that some people snap under the pressure and then commit horrible crimes. And I think it's interesting that he keeps referring to serial killers. He mentions Ted Bundy, I think.
Gaines,
yeah. So it's this idea of them becoming notorious as well, is he just wants someone to notice him and be remembered. But it's quite amusing that he gets mistaken for lots of other people.
I mean, and that's kind of the worst thing for Patrick Bateman, as you mentioned earlier, with the whole dork comment, is that he's just so terrified of being considered anonymous and not, which it's weird. There's a strange conundrum there. It's like you want to stand out, you want to like fit in with everyone, but to the point that you all look exactly the same. Like there is no distinction. It's a confusing kind of dichotomy there, I think, and the fact that him and his coworkers are all obsessed with status and competition. It's basically like a never-ending dick measuring contest between all of them, and the fact that we never really we never get a sense for who Patrick Bateman is. I mean, he's even saying in the beginning, he's like, I don't exist, and he's just has this incredibly elaborate morning routine just to try and make sure his skin is perfect so that he can get remarks on it by the lady at the massage parlor or whatever, I think. And I wonder what he is actually like. The only real, I think, indication that we get about what Patrick is like when he's not trying to fit in is his violent revolt against the system, I guess, and then also like all this quote like mainstream music that he listens to, that he's like really, he only tells people about his taste in music when he's about to murder them, basically. It's the only time that he's really upfront about it, because you see him in the car with Evelyn at one point and he's listening to Robert Palmer, and then other than that he talks about Whitney Houston and Huey Lewis, Phil Collins, really poppy musicians of the time, but not really considered, I guess, cool by his crowd. So I thought that was kind of an interesting running commentary, that like the kind of music that he listens to and how he was so protective of his taste in music until he's getting ready to axe murder somebody, basically. And of course, I'm talking about the Huey, that famous, which now we have that great gif of him dancing in the little, and that's the other thing. This movie has had such enormous cultural relevance, and I think in large part because of how resonant its themes are, that this movie made $15 million at the box office domestically and $34 million worldwide, and yet people are still referring to it. People still talk about it. You even have, I think, on your Twitter thing, returning some videotapes. So it's crazy that this movie has stood the test of time in that way. What do you, I guess I was gonna say, why do you think that is? But I think we already kind of touched on that.
Yeah. No, I think it's just a movie now that is more relevant now than it was back in 2000 when it came out. Because our society has become this idea of, everything's superficial, everything's about the image. I'm not saying that everyone's like that, but there is a large proportion of people who are, look at how often we try to take a selfie and get the best angle. I'm just imagine what Patrick Bateman would be like in today's society. Like, how obsessed would he be about Twitter followers? I always want to see it remade so I could see that. Well,
even in the film, he's filming a lot of his murders, just I guess for his own entertainment or whatever. But that's actually one question I was going to ask. Like, what do you think would happen for Patrick Bateman after this movie ends? Like, if they were to make a sequel set now, or set sometime in the late 90s or something. What do you think would happen? Because in this movie, he basically kind of confesses to his violent urges multiple times throughout the course of the movie. So, but either nobody hears him or understands him. I mean, there's actually the slyest moment that I recognize of that, when he says, "Oh, I'm really into murders and executions," and the lady's like, "Oh, most people I know who are into mergers and acquisitions, really don't enjoy it," or something like that. So clearly, most of when he's confessing, it's probably a lot of it's in his head. So, do you think any of these murders actually happened? Did the ending of the movie kind of says not? And if so, what happens next for him? How thin is the line before he just eventually starts killing people for real, I guess, is probably what the next thing is.
Yeah. I feel like he would get into politics,
That's the best answer
then
you could have possibly said. Especially nowadays.
I think that he wouldn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he would get other people's, like, to do his dirty work for him. I just feel like he would be the person that's like, like a Al Gore type of, but I don't know American politics, so I apologize. Who's the guy that's in Vice, who's also Christian Bale?
Oh, Dick Cheney.
Dick Cheney. I don't know your politics at all, but I was trying to Al Gore someone completely different, isn't it?
Nowadays, yes, it is. Nowadays, you're probably better off not knowing our politics, honestly.
Well, I just picture it like that. I feel like he would want to go and invade these countries because, why not? And go and, it as a sort of status, a symbol or something, So I feel like he would definitely do very well in politics. I think I read somewhere once that most, like, a large proportion of people who go into, like, CEOs and stuff in that type of high power jobs or have sociopathic tendencies. So I don't know. I don't know whether that's true or a myth. So don't quote me on that. But yeah, there's definitely something you need to have some sort of.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
if you want to say that he'd be Donald Trump, you can just say that.
Okay, I'll just say that. Yeah.
Not to get too political, but I mean, even people on both sides of the political spectrum recognize the situation with that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much in this movie. As a straight white male who tries to not be a terrible person, there's a lot of stuff in here. Like, not even the murder. It's just like the way he talks to his secretary, like everything. So as a woman, how do you feel about the treatment of women in this movie? Not just the violence, just like the attitudes, like the men are all sitting around saying like, oh, there's no such thing as a girl with a good personality. A girl's talented, whatever that means. Only ones that are talented are the ugly ones because they have to, whatever, like all that stuff, which is just almost as upsetting for me to watch as the actual violence scenes. So how is, what is your, I mean, obviously it's satirical, but still.
Yeah, I think that there's one scene for me which really stands out is when I think it's very early on in the film and he's walking down like the road and there's a woman in front of him and you get this sense like, oh my God, something bad's going to happen to her. But then they just reach that point of like about to cross the road and he just looks at her and it's that I've been in a situation where you've been alone late at night and I've, been walking and you feel like someone's like following you and you feel so threatened and you get to, I don't think anyone could have captured that who hasn't been in that situation before. I feel like that's a very personal moment and it really left me quite shook up by it, in terms of the violence and everything. That's very shocking as well. But that one moment is, something that I've actually experienced before of being, having to, cross the road, having to go another route, walking faster and not having, anyone else around to ask for help, but it's a very uncomfortable situation. And in terms of I suppose you would call it locker talk that goes on between the men, I mean, it's just so, I mean, anyone who watches those scenes and thinks, oh, that's so cool, they're talking like that, oh, I really admire that, then I don't know. I hope there aren't people like that, but it's just really uncomfortable. But it tells us so much about the characters without actually, giving us the whole backstory. We know about those characters and how they think and how they, like I said, everybody else that's around Patrick is also quite awful. So he's, and the fact that he wants to fit in and be like them is, shocking, because why would you want to be like those people how they, like you say, how he talks to his poor secretary, who I think is, the only nice character in that film.
Yeah, I think so. And I think some part of Patrick recognizes that, because whether it's imagined or not, he at one point has her there and is prepared to kill her. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, I wonder how much of that really happened and how much of that was in his own head. But, I think that because he tells her to leave or something bad might happen. Of course, she thinks she's going to be hurt, as in like they're going to hook up and then he's going to break her heart or something. When in actuality, she could get murdered any second. Yeah, I think that the movie is really smart about the way that it really just focuses in on the business cards, which is a big trigger for him. That's why he wants to go and kill Paul Allen. He can't deal with how perfect the business card is, and he's getting all sweaty and freaking out. And the dinner reservations, which are like the only thing these guys talk about are their dinner reservations, to the point that he fakes taking Courtney to Dorsia, like by like, I guess, I don't know if he drugged her up or what was going on there exactly, but to kind of pretend pass a different restaurant off at that so that word can get around that, oh, I got a reservation at Dorsia. But the other element of that I think is great is that the satire in the food that they talk about, like literally every dish that they mention sounds completely made up. I mean, I think I wrote one down. There was like mud soup and charcoal arugula. I'm like, what the hell is that? All the food is so silly, but it sounds like something that these like quote upscale restaurants would serve. So it's like the business cards. It's everybody kind of stumbling over each other to no end, really. How do you feel about the reservation thing and like the way that I guess the more playful aspects of the movie? I mean, it even opens up the very opening shots of the movie. It's like looks like blood, but it's like raspberry drizzle or whatever the hell is doing something with the restaurant. Again, tying into the whole reservation thing.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it says so much about how odd our culture is, that we have these extremely wealthy people who are obsessed about the not even eating the food, because I don't think anyone actually eats any of it.
No, I don't think so.
I think they just get it, and then it's like a piece of art. It's ridiculous. Like when we see it, when it's presented, and it doesn't even sound like you could eat it, like charcoal, whatever. That just sounds disgusting. And then he has that moment where he's talking about all the problems that are facing the world. And he's on about Sri Lanka, I think, and he says some other countries. And you're just like, he's such a hypocrite. He's just saying things that it's almost like he's just repeating them from what he's heard on TV or on the radio. He doesn't believe into any of that. And it's all so fake. And that's what is interesting about the film, because it's never making an obvious joke to us. It's treating us quite intelligent, allowing us to come to our own conclusions about that. And we can see it, and we're like, yeah, this is just such a fake world, but would we want to be part of it? That's the odd thing, is like, do we want to be part of this world where we get to eat in really fancy restaurants and drive around in limos and stuff and wear Rolexes? It's so like disturbing to that fact, because we've all been there where we've seen like a handbag, or not in your case, maybe in your case, but you've seen like a really expensive item, and you can probably go pick up something equally as good from a local supermarket or whatever, and you think, oh, but it's got a name to it, it's got a name attached to it, and then if I get this, I'll be a status symbol.
Yeah, exactly. You even see that when he's taking the overnight bag early on with the presumably Paul Allen's body, and the only thing the other guy Lewis notices is, oh, is that this brand? He's like, no, that's this one. And apparently the movie had issues like getting the rights to certain songs for the murder scenes and to certain like designer brands to be mentioned and things like that, because they like some of them didn't want to be associated in that context, which I can understand.
Yeah, I think as well, isn't there, there's a bit where he goes to the laundry place. He's trying to get his sheets cleaned, and it's like, so, you know, he's like, there's blood or whatever it is on those sheets, and she says, oh, you have to use bleach to get them out, and he's like, you can't use bleach. Do you know how much these cost and all that? And it's like, he's almost like, that could be something that could get him caught if he is committing the crimes.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that these sheets happen to cost like, oh gosh, I don't know, crazy amount of money, and he doesn't want to ruin them, is like, well, if you are a serial killer, would you really be that stupid?
Well, I think the sheets are one element that's kind of goes against the twist at the end of the movie. I know Bret Easton Ellis was a little disappointed in certain aspects of the adaptation, because I guess the book is more of an unreliable narrator from the beginning, whereas the movie treats it as kind of a twist towards the end. I think the sheets there early on are kind of an outlier, where it's like, well, is it blood? Is it, what is that about? Do you think that they should have had kind of thrown the true nature of the murders into doubt early on, or do you like that? You think it's more effective as kind of a climactic reversal?
I kind of do and I don't. The twist kind of works. Yeah, there's just too many scenes that seem to don't add up. Mm-hmm. Where has poor Alan actually gone? Why the whole bit with the estate agent? She acts really dodgy. Like, I suggest you don't come here again. And the whole thing about the Times ads and it's all been painted and redecorated. Why? Yeah. Why would it need being painted and redecorated? Yes, there's just lots of things that don't add up. So, would it be worse if the fact that those who are around him know that he's a serial killer and they're covering up for him? Isn't that even more horrifying? I
think the thing is, too, that the kind of the ultimate statement of the movie is that whether he or not he killed these people, or any of them or some of them, it kind of almost doesn't matter, because he's never going to live up to, like, and I think that's not to get too much into the ending, but I think that's kind of ultimately like the kind of, from Patrick's perspective, the tragedy of the ending is that it all meant nothing. Like, he doesn't, like, even to stand out to make himself notorious, people are like, I don't care, where's my dinner reservation? And I think that's that kind of dissection of that lifestyle, as you mentioned, I think is something you only get from a female filmmaker. And then, Mary Harron co-wrote this with Guinevere Turner, who's actually plays Elizabeth in the movie. Yeah, which is funny. And I love the fact that she mocks Patrick about his taste in Whitney Houston. Yeah. Like that moment where he looks so like pissed off at her. Yeah. Because he goes on in his passionate rant about how powerful her music is, and she says nobody listens to Whitney Houston anymore. Are there people that feel like this movie glorifies that lifestyle? Because you mentioned Fight Club earlier, and I know some people think that movie makes being in a fight club and being this ultra masculine guy seem really cool. And that's actually a conversation I already recorded with someone else. We're going to be airing that next week after this one. So that was an interesting conversation looking back at that movie. But do you think this film has been misread by, I'm assuming, straight white males? I think potentially. I can almost see like this film potentially being taken over by like the incel type of movement because of its violence towards women. And then that's the scary thing is, you put something out there and it's open to multiple interpretations because, we say, like we said, the ending, is it really based on, is he the killer or not?
And, if you suddenly read that and you've got a sort of toxic viewpoint of women, then you might side with his actions that, he commits during the film. So, there's, I haven't really come across that, but
That's
I'm
probably
sure
for the best.
yeah, I'm sure there's potentially those who are out there who probably side with him and root for him to commit all those crimes.
I really like so much of the imagery in the film. I think says so much. I mean, there's that famous shot that I think is even in the trailer of him taking off his like face mask, and it's the metaphor for the mask of his. He even says the mask of my sanity is about to slip, and I really love that image because it is like he's a completely different person when he's around. As you mentioned, he's like really showboating, and I wonder how much of even the comments that he makes to his secretary, like if he even necessarily feels that way, or he's like, this is the way I have to be. I need to put her down and put her in her place because that's the world I live in. And I feel like he has a lot of things on in the background that I think at one point he's on the phone. He just got porn randomly playing in the background. He's like working out and he's got Texas Chainsaw Massacre on like early in the morning, I guess. And there's like all these things that he's like constantly trying to reaffirm his own masculinity. He's like really narcissistic. He's looking at himself in the mirror while he's having sex with the prostitutes. And apparently this is one of the first times that Christian Bale was really physically committed to a role. So I guess that's kind of a good transition. Let's talk about what is it about Christian Bale's performance? Apparently he. Part of his role here was inspired by Nicolas Cage in Vampire's Kiss, which I can see with that kind of over-the-top acting. You can see elements of that a little bit, some of his facial expressions and things like that. What is it about Christian Bale that in this role that you think makes him such a great fit? And, could you really have seen anybody else in this at that point?
Yeah, I think originally they wanted Leonardo DiCaprio in this role.
Mm-hmm. And Oliver Stone, I think, too, to direct it, which would have been the hyper-masculine version that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I don't think that really would have worked. I mean, maybe not as Leonardo DiCaprio back in the late 90s. I mean, I don't know. I just picture him back from that period as Jack from Titanic. So it's really hard to sort of see him transition into, a darker role. I just don't know whether he would have had the maturity to do that.
Yeah, not at that time. I think his Wolf of Wall Street, I think, has maybe shades of that slimy guy in a suit.
Yeah, it would have been really... I just can't imagine it at all. But I read that Bale was inspired by Tom Cruise for this role. Yeah, which, looking at it, I can understand, especially when you see that famous interview he talks about Scientology, and he's all laughing and joking and doing like that really odd laugh that goes on for a bit too long. And he's just look like the smile, it's far too wide. So yeah, I can certainly see how he would have been inspiration.
And this is years before Tom Cruise's like famous, Oprah
Meltdown
appearance, jumping on the couch and all that. And I mean, if you couple that with the persistent rumors about his sexuality and all that, how he needs to prove his masculinity. I mean, that was a kind of a good observation on the part of Bale, because you can totally see that in this performance.
Yeah, it's down to like even when he's around, he's trying so hard to smile, and it just doesn't seem natural. Because when that ending where he does, he says, "Oh, I'm just a happy camper," and then you cut to him, and his face is just completely devoid of any emotion, as the camera sort of zooms in tighter and tighter to just his eyes. And yeah, it's such a great performance, because it goes from like, I could see the Nicolas Cage aspects of, absolutely going complete crazy, and like in Vampire's Kiss, that sort of erratic behavior. But at the same time, it's not just acting crazy or, for the entire performance. There's more to it. There's more layers to it, and it's a brilliant sort of transition from overreacting and overacting and being hyper to being emotionless and devoid of any sort of real emotion that Bale manages to convey. And he does it like, I don't know how he does it. It's amazing. Like in the same scene, he'll just go from one emotional state to the next. It just like such a quick transition.
This was kind of instrumental in him getting Batman, because he is doing he's doing the layers in Batman Begins to a different extent, obviously, but in that he's focused on fighting crime, but then has to kind of pretend to be this playboy, and it's like him wearing a mask like as Bruce Wayne. And then I think in that regard, that's probably part of the reason he's probably the best Bruce Wayne we've ever had, because he brings the same kind of skill set to that role, in that he can fit in with those guys, but we can see that it's all a facade. I mean, I mentioned the gif of him in the raincoat earlier, but there's also that gif of him making the face when he's talking to Paul Allen, and he's like, "Oh, Patrick Bateman, what a loser. He's with that Evelyn, great ass, whatever." And he's making that face, like smile, and like kind of like that whole his reaction shot to that is so much going on on his face in that one moment. And I think it's impressive how he's kind of playing, I don't know, at least 2 or 3 characters in this one performance.
Yeah, it's really good, and I think it shows the complexity of the character, because I think anyone else could have just played it as just a straight sociopath, psychopath type of role. You do feel sort of sympathetic in a way towards his character, because he just does seem so pathetic. I mean, he does seem like a dork, but at the same time he's a threat to you, so you feel very threatened by his presence and how he can quickly change from one emotional state to the next. So and I think as well, Bale was unknown at the time, so it's the fact that people didn't realize he was British until after filming had stopped, because his American accent was so convincing, just really shows his sort of level of commitment to the role.
He's like a rat in a cage, and he doesn't know what to do to get out of it, and so that's simmers in him, and kind of murderous fantasy that I guess he creates for himself, assuming that none of the murders really happened, because there's that Gene finds the drawing. So I guess the implication is that he's kind of been just sketching away in his office because we never see anybody do any work in this movie either. He criticizes her outfit, and then he turns on Jeopardy. We don't know what he's doing in his office all this time. So what is your take on that? Do you think any of the murders really happened, or are they just kind of his losing touch with reality because he doesn't know, he's lost all sense of himself, I guess?
I think maybe a couple of the murders might actually happen. I'm thinking maybe the homeless man happened, because it's completely believable in that situation. It's not done. I mean, it's violent, but it's not done in an excessive, almost outlandish type of way. It's actually done in a setting that he's not familiar with, and you could almost see that sort of happening. I mean, and potentially maybe the poor Alan to extent. But I wonder whether the ones with the women actually happen, because like you mentioned earlier, we see him with Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the background, and maybe he's just fantasizing about that because he's seen the film and he's connecting it, and maybe reliving some sort of fantasy in his head. And the fact that his approach towards women, they don't really seem to like him. They kind of find him a bit of a dork, and not really, they laugh at him. So maybe it's him sort of imagining these scenarios. But yeah, it does reach a point where if he's not going to be, if he's not committed the crimes now, then I think it's definitely going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's unnerving, is the fact that we're just, you're almost waiting for it to happen. Will he be the type of person that just snaps one day at the office? There's the potential there. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I think that's part of what's so ominous about the way the film ends, is that, he's saying, there's been no catharsis. I have no deeper knowledge of myself. This confession has meant nothing. And you can almost feel like he would be one of those people you'd read about on the news that just shows up to his office one day with a machine gun or something, It just completely snaps and goes off because he's just doing anything he can to basically imagine or this elaborate power trip, because he feels so powerless in his own life. He's just trying to get his reservations, trying to get his business cards, trying to get people to see him a certain way, trying to get acceptance, and not getting anywhere with it. And, to the point that he's in a completely emotionless state at all times, including with his apparent fiance. And I feel like it's almost intentional that he stresses blonde prostitutes only, almost because he wants to punish his fiance, who we haven't even mentioned. Like, a lot of the supporting cast of this film, and we got Reese Witherspoon and Willem Dafoe, Chloe Sevigny, Josh Lucas, Jared Leto, Justin Theroux. Like, there's a lot of big people in this movie, and I think it's interesting specifically that Reese Witherspoon is in this, because this was that year, like right after Cruel Intentions, right around the time of election. She was pretty much about to pop, and yet she's kind of the I don't know, the put upon fiance basically in this. So I mean, I think he's definitely just looking for some semblance of meaning in this. I mean, he even says at one point when he's with Jean in his apartment and he's seeing a woman's head in his freezer and kind of figuring out what weapon he's going to use. He says, I guess you could say, I want a meaningful relationship with someone special. I think that's honestly probably the most, other than the confession scene, probably the most genuine he's been that film. Like, I think he really means that. And I don't, he doesn't see any recourse for that. And it kind of leads into is kind of his either breakdown or breakthrough, like him actually trying to fight against those urges more. Because right after that sequence, he breaks up with Evelyn, probably because he's probably going to kill her at some point if he doesn't get out of that situation. So I feel like there's a segment of the film where he recognizes what he's doing, and he's trying to sort of stop himself.
There's that moment where I guess it's just that scene where he takes on all the police, and we could probably agree that that's not real. That's clearly a fantasy. So he knows it's a fantasy because he shoots the car and it blows up, and he looks at the gun like
he's like, I'm in an action movie. How did that happen?
Oh yeah. And I wonder whether that's whether he's got schizophrenia or something. He's having a manic episode, and he's in the street. You can almost think about like people watching someone like that having a breakdown and living out some sort of fantasy that they can only see. It's almost like he's trying his hardest to snap out of whatever this fantasy that he's created, but maybe in the end he just almost accepts it. He asks for help, and he tries to confess to people like, this is what potentially is going to happen, and nobody wants to know. And that's what in that end, I think he sort of succumbs to whatever illness that he has potentially.
That's when we're in straight up fantasy land. Right before that, the ATM is telling him to feed a stray cat, and then he goes on a crazy rampage. Like, I think in a way it's kind of similar to something like Shutter Island or wherever, where you're trying to get you're trying to, this is your last gasp at trying to break out of I guess this corporate prison, this capitalist corporate construct, that social construct basically that he's trapped in. And I think that's kind of part of why the movie is so upsetting is that, yes, it's violent imagery. Yes, it's this disgusting attitude towards women, but it's also like at the end he's just like, well, I guess this is the world. Like he doesn't get better, he doesn't like seek treatment, he doesn't like nothing is ultimately accomplished. It's all kind of futile in the end. And I think that the title is specifically relevant to the United States and the American kind of, this is, work harder so you can pay for this thing, so you can achieve this status level and all that. And obviously that's not strictly a national thing, but I mean, in the 1980s, this film is really encapsulating that kind of pursuit of wealth, of fame. And as you said, now it's even more so. Now that's gotten so much worse because of social media, because of technology, because we've become even more obsessed with celebrity.
What's interesting is he quotes all these songs which are talking about finding your true love and being true to yourself, and all these messages of like self-love and empowering stuff, and he knows it all, but he repeats it back, and he talks about the meanings of Whitney Houston songs and all that, and he doesn't carry any of that out. He doesn't live by those rules, that are stated in those songs. So
it's like the way he wants the world to be. Like he wants the world to, even though he's dorky, he wants it to be hip, to be square, which is I think part of what his appeal of that song is. So it's like he's loses himself in this world where those things, hold true to him and to the world around him, as opposed to what he sees every day. Yeah,
and I think the choice of music in this film is just brilliant, and I don't think you could get a more iconic scene than the hip to be square scene. It's just like, just everything about that scene is, when he's got the newspapers down, so he doesn't want to ruin the floor because he's it's just like, so it's almost, something bad's going to happen, but you don't know exactly how it's going to happen. And like you say, we don't actually see the aftermath of disposing of the body. I think that's what would maybe someone else, another director, might have wanted to explore, and maybe a lot more graphic detail. I'm kind of relieved that we don't see it, but at the same time, like I said, then our mind is
and that scene, I think, is such an encapsulation of the film itself, because it's tense because something violent is about to happen, but it's also kind of hilarious and ridiculous because he's like, oh, I think this is their seminal work, and he's dancing, and he's it's such a stark contrast between the way he is literally any other time in the movie, other than when he's about to kill somebody. So it's like that's the only time he feels free to be himself in front of someone, is because, well, you're about to die, so I can tell you I really like 4 is their seminal album, that kind of thing. It's just it's in a lot of ways it's such a weird film, but it's also very very worthy of, I think, critical analysis, and it's nice to see that it's been achieving such a cult status, and that it's actually been studied in this way in some regard. So, because I think the movie has a lot to say, a lot of social criticism and satire, I think, is the best way to get a lot of these points across. I mean, you've seen a lot of that lately. I really like the movies like Sorry to Bother You, and I'm at a loss right now for other ones, but like satire, I think is a pretty clean way to make these points that ultimately people might be find less palatable.
Yeah, I think if you were to do a straight documentary about the yuppie culture in the 80s, which I suspect there probably are documentaries out there, I don't think people would necessarily sit down and watch it. But then if you were to say actually, this is a horror film, you should watch this, but it's not really a horror film, people will be more likely to sit down and digest it. And I think that's it works really well because, like I said, on the first viewing, you think, oh, this is just a. You almost go into it thinking, this is going to be a slasher movie. You know, it's called American Psycho. Is it a sequel to Psycho? I saw a bit with him with a chainsaw. You know, so you expect it's going to be just a straightforward slasher horror film, but then you get that, but you don't get that. You get something a lot more layered and complicated, a bit like the character of Patrick Bateman. So, and I just find what I like about the film is that every time I go back to watch it, I almost spot something new each time. So it's just really, there's so much there, which is really interesting to sort of analyze. Whether it's all fantasy, the characters that he interacts with. I wonder if, like, even the detective is real. You know,
that's
yeah. It's all,
he's only in basically 2 scenes. Willem Dafoe.
Yeah. So, and of course, you know, we've got so many great performances and different actors who turn up, and you're like, oh my god, it's so and so from that film. It's you know, everyone's just it's got so much going for it. I want to just ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
What music do you think Patrick Bateman would be listening to in 2019?
Ooh, what is the uncool music to listen to now? The uncool pop music. I'm trying to think. Would he be listening to like Ariana Grande or something? I wonder.
I feel like, yeah, definitely. I feel like maybe Taylor Swift.
Yes, there you go. Exactly. Which everybody, apparently, everybody is buying her music, and Ariana Grande, like all these like pop divas and things like that. I think he'd be listening to that and really dissecting. Who's like, oh, this is what Shake It Off is really about, you know?
Yeah, this is what Katy Perry's Raw is all about.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's such a rich movie, and I agree with you. Like it is, there's a lot more to it than I think a lot of people realize upon first watch. That's why, as I said, since you picked this was a great opportunity for me to go back now and see it through a completely different lens and appreciate it on a whole other level. And the fact that Christian Bale has this like, you know, perfect bone structure and like, you know, has this sort of anonymous white guy look that he in this film, I think it fits this role really well. And yeah, that's the whole movie is about appearances can be deceiving. So it makes sense that it almost makes sense that it's kind of be marketed as a slasher film, and then you go into like, oh, this is not at all what I thought it was. Just like Patrick Bateman isn't what he seems to be, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of stuff here, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about this one, because especially since it's from a female filmmaker, and because it shows you what impact it can have when you put a female perspective on a story that would ordinarily be told by a man. And I think if we got Oliver Stone's version on this, it would have been kind of Natural Born Killer style, like really graphic and really over the top and almost accused of glorifying the violence. I don't think you could really say this movie is glorifying the violence. I think terrible people might see it and be like, oh, I wish I had those suits and those glasses and those dinner reservations and those business cards. But it doesn't, as we said, the violence is barely on screen. So I don't think you could really say that it's that.
Yeah, we don't really see the violence from his point of view as well.
Right.
Especially in terms of when he kills the prostitutes. We see it from Chrissy's perspective. And she's the one that we're rooting for to get away. We're not rooting for him to kill her.
Right,
because, you know, she's actually just she comes across as quite we don't really know her character, but she doesn't come across as being like nasty, or she seems like completely genuine as a person. She's not like part of this fake world that the other people that surround him are. So yeah, I don't think it really, I don't think, to me, it definitely doesn't glorify violence, but I can definitely see that maybe other people could interpret it that way. And that's what's worrying.
Your mention about whether the detective is real, I think I hadn't really thought of that. I think that's an interesting take as well, because you can almost see it as Patrick's trying to basically construct his own narrative. He's like, ooh, I'm going to commit this murder. And then this cop who, in his two scenes, Willem Dafoe seems very, like Detective Kimball seems very suspicious of Patrick. Like he almost seems like he knows what's up, but Patrick kind of skates by. So it's almost kind of, I guess the thrill of the chase. I'm going to commit these murders, and then, this detective's going to maybe be on to me, but I'm going to get away with it. So it's, again, kind of that power trip.
Yeah, it's all just a bit of a fantasy in his head. You could always picture him going to sort of sit in a restaurant and mumbling to himself, like play acting, and nobody's paying him any attention because we're all too self-obsessed in our own business. So I definitely want to actually write about that now.
Yeah, you should. That would be great. Because I'd never thought of that part of it, and I think that's an interesting. That's the thing. There's so many different interpretations of this film. So I'm glad that we were able to kind of dig into it. I mean, we've already talked about it for a little over an hour, and I feel like there's a lot more we could have said. Is there anything that we haven't talked about regarding American Psycho that you wanted to mention before we start wrapping up?
You mentioned there was a sequel. I've not seen a sequel. Have you seen the sequel?
I have not. I've heard that it's pretty terrible. It sounds like the film is exactly what this movie seemed like it would be. It is kind of just hollow and just a basic slasher movie. And the fact that it went straight to video doesn't help matters. And the fact that it has seemingly no real super connection to this film. It's just kind of a marketing thing that they're like, well, American Psycho was a hit, so let's just make this a sequel to that in kind of post-production, basically. So I kind of have even Mila Kunis is like, yeah, that was really bad. I kind of regret that one. So I would probably recommend that listeners not really bother with that. Maybe just go watch this one again and then read some of B's analysis that I'm sure will come on Filmotomy at some point. But yeah, so no, I have not seen that.
No, I've avoided it like the plague. I mean, I love Mila Kunis. Yeah, I can't see her actually being a serial killer. She's just too cool. She's just too cool to be like dorky Patrick Bateman.
B, can you tell everybody where they can find you on social media?
So when I'm not returning videotapes, I'm over. Thanks. I've been waiting to use that all time, all the way through this podcast. So I've been thinking that one through.
That would have been a good sign off. Like, oh, thanks for having me. Yeah. I'm going to go return some videotapes.
Yeah. Ah, oh, darn it. I've done it too early, haven't I? Anyway, when I'm not returning videotapes, you can find me over at Film Twitter, and I am at the Film B, and you can also find me over at Filmotomy. And like I say, we're about to go back to rewind 1957 next, so which will be really interesting. So lots of films to be discussed there. I think I'm personally going to be writing about The Incredible Shrinking Man, which is one of my favorite films as a kid, so that's going to be one I'm going to love to revisit. And you can also find my stuff at Next Best Picture, Jump Cut, online, and wherever else. Whoever needs me, I'll come and write for them.
She's everywhere, is what she's saying. Basically, you can't run into a bit of film analysis online and not find Bianca's stuff. So, Bianca Garner, thank you so much for coming on the Crooked Table podcast. I'd love to have you on another time, and I'll definitely keep you posted on In Their Own League, and I would be honored to show up on there at some point.
Oh, but brilliant! I would love you to come on, and I'm sure. There's plenty more horror films by women that we can explore and discuss in great detail.
Oh yeah, for sure.
If you're interested in joining me on the show to chat about one of your favorite films, head on over to crookedtable.com/guest. Or you can consider supporting the show at patreon.com/crookedtable. Of course, you can always find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies over at crookedtable.com. Until next time, this has been the Crooked Table Podcast, and I've been Rob.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
That's the yard of the little KED.